Hello, everybody. I just want to record this special episode. Actually, I decided I will make these two special episodes. This one, there will be shorter than usual. And this one will focus on the 7 levels of war, which builds on what I've discussed about the philosophies of war before. And then the second part to come next week will focus on the concept of Ukro-Buddhism. And I will explain what that means next week. So today we will look at the 7 different levels of war and what that means is specifically in the context of the war against Ukraine and the Russian aggression. So this actually, this framework was developed as early as 2014 when the Russian aggression was first initiated against Ukraine in the Crimea and then in Donbass region. It was revised several times throughout the years, most recently earlier this year, analyzing the strategic changes on the battlefield and in geopolitics in general. So I will discuss the most recent version of it and explain the context as we go along. So the first level of war, and so I want to make a reference also. Originally this was developed by several people, but one name that's associated with this framework is Valery Pekar. He's a well-known analyst and a public speaker on these matters. And then later it was reformulated in a slightly different way by another Ukrainian analyst and media expert called Dmytro Zolotukhin. He used to work in the Ukrainian government as a deputy minister of information politics between when President Poroshenko was still in power before Volodymyr Zelensky was elected. If I'm not mistaken, it's between 2017 and 2019. But he continues to be media expert, and he actually has manages this think tank, an institute called Institute of Postinformation Society. And so he participates actively in public discussions and debates, and so he took this framework and rethought and reformulated it to update it to most current realities on the battlefield and in the world. So let's begin. 7 levels. The first level we will be discussing is the most local one, and then we'll build from there to the most global one. So the first level, in this sense, it's a war for Ukrainian identity and for Ukrainian independence and for Ukrainian subjectivity in the international arena. So it's also basically a war for decolonization. This is existential war for Ukraine, defending its territorial integrity, its sovereignty, its independence from the former imperial metropole, trying to reconquer the former colony and to subjugate it and to control everything that happens in it. So within this context, one can also distinguish the internal struggles between what we can call Maidan against what we can call Hydra of corruption. So that's internally in Ukraine. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there has been this struggle internally against corruption, the legacies of the Soviet demoralization, atomization of society, and so that struggle still continues in the background, but it's clearly takes the backstage to the primary existential concern to defend the existence of an independent Ukrainian state and nation. So that's the first level. Second level of war is the most obvious one: Ukraine versus Russia. It's this so it's already entangled with the first level, but it's slightly distinct in the sense that Russian aggression in 2022. So this is where the line between the war as it started in 2014 and the war as it was continued in 2022 with the so-called full-scale invasion. So up till 2022, Russia has been trying to deny its involvement and pretend it's some kind of a civil war, quote unquote, or a internal conflict, but that was clearly a lie, and everybody knew this. And I talk about this in a previous episode on the propagandist lies told since 2014. And so today, so since 2022, basically this conflict changed its character and then became all-out war, total war of Russia versus Ukraine. So those are the first two levels. And they may be said to be taking place on the geopolitical level, and in the sense that, as I discussed von Clausewitz in the previous episodes, the philosophies of war, it's a kind of an instrument of state policy, right? The war as an instrument of state policy, and so these two levels, the territory is territory, control. Those are the basic considerations of these two first levels. Third level, we can call it NATO versus USSR or USA against Russia. These are just two ways of explaining it, but basically it's this brinkmanship between Moscow and Washington, DC, and so both NATO and USSR may be seen as simulacra, as a not real. We see that NATO, although it still exists on paper, it hasn't been very effective in countering the Russian aggression, and really much depends on what USA does. So these are just two different ways of describing the same level of conflict between the USA and the Russian aggression, or between NATO and the attempt by Russia to reestablish some sort of USSR-like entity, an empire, right? So it's a way to seek revanchism for the USSR falling apart like that, and so this level of conflict happens on the more in the geoeconomic sphere than geopolitical one. At least from the point of view of USA, for example, USA is not leading a direct war against Russia right now, but they're using all kinds of geoeconomic ways, sanctions, cooperating with Europe on those sanctions, and trying to find different ways, non-military, not directly military ways of pressuring Russia, but not, unfortunately, not doing it decisively enough, and not this is what makes it a little bit of a strange conflict. So because Russia is basically fighting the war only on the geopolitical level, first and foremost, and by bombarding Ukraine and by also interfering in Europe on various levels. From the point of view of USA, they're fighting a geoeconomic war. And that's a sort of, one may, Valery Pekar initially explained this difference, is that the geoeconomic war, that's a higher level where the players involved in that level of conflict are not so interested in territory. They're interested in economic control or economic advantages, profits. And so in some sense, their interest for whom this war against Ukraine on the physical level is a profitable one. And so, and this criticism has been aired by many different voices. And so so their geopolitical level, or these interests are not so keen on letting the war deteriorate to the pure geopolitical level, because that means destruction and less opportunities to gain, to profit from it. So in some sense, you can say, Russia is fighting only in the geopolitical level. They're destroying everything in their path. They're not interested in what happens to it after they just want to conquer. They want to destabilize Ukraine, destabilize the European Union, destabilize NATO and the world order. For USA and other interests in geoeconomic level, they're looking to rebuild Ukraine, to put money in Ukraine with infrastructure projects, and so maybe gain profit that way, the so-called disaster capitalism. So there's all these different considerations going on this level. It gets more complex as you go along, obviously, as you move up each level, but we have to move on at this time. Level number four, it's generalized kind of notion of the West against the indeterminate future. So it's basically, you could say, it's status quo versus change. So the world order as it is now, or as it has existed until the Russian war against Ukraine, is slowly crumbling, and that's becoming more and more obvious with each day. And the Trump administration and its behavior has also undermined the world order for quite significantly in recent in this year alone. But there are obviously interests who, again, those geoeconomic interests who are not interested in upsetting the status quo, but because they don't know what will come afterwards. And so there is this tension where certain interests in various countries may not be making decisions based on their proclaimed values, humanism and the democracy and the rule of law, but they're more thinking in terms of just keeping the status quo going. And because if they allow this conflict, this war against Ukraine, to achieve some conclusion, if, let's say, peace is gained, it's unclear what will happen, how the world order will change depending on the outcome of the war. So for Russia, they want to destabilize the existing world order as much as possible, to return it to more wild kind of might makes right world, kind of the world. And to a certain extent, they have been successful in destabilizing the structure. But in other ways, they've been already defeated because Ukraine didn't fall apart. They put up resistance, and they have endured for the past almost 4 years. And they will, and that's already a defeat for Russia, who wanted a quick and an easy victory when they invaded in 2022. So next level. And this fourth level is basically unclear future of the Western liberal democracy and the rule-based order. The question is, who makes rules in this order, and who is at the top of the pyramid, so to speak. There are those who criticize the USA rule-based order as hypocritical, and there's much reason for those criticisms. There's substantial examples of double standards. So, but we won't go into the analysis deeper than that at the time being. So next level, fifth level, is USA against China. So these are two superpowers currently in the world by all measures. And so at this level, basically it's two huge economic superpowers, and they're also so entangled with each other that it's hard sometimes to separate their interests. They both understand that they are the most powerful players in the world today, and so they're economically, they're so intertwined that they can't really exist without one another. So that's why this conflict on this level becomes very strange. But neither liberal democracy and the capitalistic system of USA-dominated world order can prevail at this moment in time, nor the Chinese authoritarian model can prevail. So this tension continues to grind on, and very slowly, developing very slowly. And at this level, again, this is geoeconomic uh, level of war, and also partially moving into geocultural level, which is the ontological level, which we'll talk about next. But it's a blend of both, and then that's a higher level than geopolitical, then geoeconomic, and then geocultural or ontological, the war of values, and the whole conception of the world in general. So these two huge machines, USA and China, obviously they're trying to establish hegemony in the world, as it often happens when you have, as it used to be during Cold War. The USSR and the USA were competing, and now it's China versus USA. It's not going to be the repetition of the same kind of situation, but the dynamic of bipolar world, and the rest of the world also has to come to terms with this new constellation of powers, but the rest of the world is also much different than it used to be during the Cold War, and also to analyze, the Cold War ended really through geoeconomic means. There was no military conflict. The USSR simply imploded because of the armaments race, and it economically just exhausted itself due to its internal rigidity and backwardness, and collapsed on itself. And so this Russia today is much weaker than USSR ever was. It's less capable, and it just pretends to be a superpower, but it is not. So on this level of USA against China, Russia is a mere stage where this conflict plays out itself. And Ukraine, unfortunately, Ukraine is not even mentioned at this level. It's not significant enough economically, or to make a difference at this level of conflict between USA and China. But obviously for Ukrainians and for Ukraine, that doesn't matter. For them, existential level, the geopolitical level, and also partially geoeconomic level are the primary levels at which this war is being fought. But, and that's what the important part is, that if Ukraine wants to become successful, the first level, the level for the war for subjectivity, for independence, it has to elevate its game, so to speak. It's not a game, but it elevate its strategy and its diplomacy to the level of geocultural and geoeconomic concerns, to become a subject, participant in those discussions, in those debates. And slowly Ukraine has been doing that in recent years. So with that, we're moving on to the sixth level, and that's the more ontological level. Basically, it's the conflict between geopolitics and geoeconomics in some ways, and that's the world of the borders against the world of the roads. And I'll explain what that means. That means that the world of the borders, it's more of a world of yesterday. That's when there are strict boundaries, territorial sovereignty, and each nation state, let's say, is sort of autarkic, or meaning self-governed, self-ruled, and can determine everything about its own fate. It's an idealized situation. It's never been that way. The states have always been interdependent, at least to some extent, and even more so since at least the 1970s, as the globalization, the new wave of globalization started to develop. Even today, with all the telecommunication technologies, it's even more so. So that's the world of and China and Russia are trying to bring that world back into the present and into the future, possibly by limiting the internet, how it's used, how the data is accessed, the siloing, and that's one of the possible developments, that the world gets fractured, and these, if they are successful, and this interdependence and connection will be destroyed by actors such as Russia and China. And then the world of the roads, it's a more horizontal way of looking at the world. It's a opening up flows of people, capital, goods, services, and information, and more. So if the in this context, if the hero of the world of the borders is a warrior or a military, strong military archetype, the hero of the world of the roads is a transnational corporation that can move its goods and workers and services anywhere they please in the world. So for some, it's obviously not all positive, and the critiques of neoliberalism and the way the world functions today, there's many critiques, and many of them are justified. But this isn't a normative description; it's just a description of what we're facing. So geopolitical, the world of borders fights on the geopolitical level for territory, for control, physical control of territory, and then geoeconomics is the instrument of choice for the world of roads, because the financial incentives, the economic instruments, those are more connected with the world of roads. And so that's already a geocultural and ontological level, which values are more are emphasized and which are prioritized. Obviously, when you prioritize your borders and political, military might over financial and informational and telecommunicational influence, cultural influence via, let's say, Hollywood or TV and other cultural products. So that's a more ontological cultural level. And then the final seventh level of analysis here, and probably the most difficult to explain very simply, but it's good versus evil, because it's easily can be degraded or deteriorated in discussion into some simplistic black and white discussion that there's some metaphysical evil, metaphysical good, and they're both this eternal fight of good versus evil, or David versus Goliath is another metaphor one could use, mythical biblical story. But it's very important. Again, it's even higher in the cultural and ontological hierarchy, more general, more metaphysical. But it does play a big role in how things are defined and in politics and communication and media. So in this conflict, in terms of conflict in Ukraine, good versus evil is very clear, because Russia is a clear aggressor. There is no kind of gray territory, gray ground, middle ground between what's good, what's evil. For the time being, it's very clear, but it need not stay that way. If a peace is achieved at some point in the near future, there are forces that are prepared, even in many countries in the West and in the USA, to stop viewing Russia as evil and stop viewing Ukraine as just unequivocal good. And so that's a danger from, if you appease the Kremlin regime too quickly, or if the peace achieved is not also just one, then these categories will be blurred, and it will not end well in the long term. At the same time, if we take a conflict in Israel, the October 7th attack by Hamas was clearly seen as a horrific genocidal event, but then the reaction from Israel blurred the categories of good versus evil very quickly because of the overreaction and excessive destruction and of Gaza. And also genocidal actions on the part of Israel. So these situations like that highlight how difficult it is sometimes in on the world arena to define these categories. And another question that many analysts and so-called futurologists ask is, what happens, let's say, if Russia is defeated and the peace achieved will be just and lasting, and in a way you remove this notion of evil is defeated, and then so what will take its place? How will the world function without this notion of there being an evil empire or an evil regime somewhere against which one needs to fight? If we go back a level, two levels, both China and USA in some ways are not interested in defeating the evil completely, because then they will not have this for USA, they will not have this defined enemy to mobilize against, and for China, then the attention might shift to its own practices, and from Russia to Chinese internal practices, and China may occupy that, become this evil, the next evil possibly. So, and neither of players of these two major players are interested in that, and so this is interesting. Well, not interesting, but this is important to consider as a dimension of this conflict. Excuse me. So, and if Russia is defeated, many other countries besides China and USA, their way of seeing the world and how the world might change and how the international dynamics might change, it brings up a lot of anxiety and uncertainty, and so these ontological level considerations, both on the level of the world of roads and the world of borders conflicting, and good versus evil, these are more, they're not defined by borders. So they're, within each country there are forces that might be on either side of this conflict, of this opposition. So let's say in Russia there are players who are interested in the world of roads, or in financial flows, and maintaining that, and being able to participate in them, but they're just not in power. The current regime is more interested in the territorial gains and the world of borders. The same thing in America. There are different groups who have different interests and vie against each other for power and influence. So these are exceedingly complicated matters, but I just wanted to introduce you to this framework, and because I found it very fascinating, and somehow it didn't come to my attention previously, but it has been around for a number of years now. As I said, the earliest formulation of this 7-level analysis was in 2014. By Valery Pekar, and but it's been updated and rethought and reformulated several times since 2022, because obviously the conflict developed in many unpredictable ways, including to the Kremlin regime itself. So thank you for listening. And I implore you to continue supporting Ukraine with everything you can. And if you can support my content here, like, share, comment if you have any comments. And next episode, next week, I will also briefly talk about Ukro-Buddhism and what that means in the context of today's discussion as well. Thank you, and keep supporting Ukraine.